Good evening. Tonight we begin with a topic not exactly sleep-friendly. Specifically, how long can the human body survive while being torn apart piece by piece? Heartwarming bedtime thoughts, right? Imagine this. It's a gray, dismal afternoon in an old European city, maybe London or Rome or Paris during the Middle Ages. The sky is heavy and low. The ground soaked with mud and garbage, the air thick with the stench of animal waste and coal smoke. Hooves clatter, vendors shout, and hundreds of people gather in the central square, not for a festival or play, but to witness a man being executed. And no, this isn't a quick death. This is a public torture staged like a play of blood. Tonight's main character, William Wallace. Someone you might know from that famous movie with the blue-painted face shouting, "Freedom." But what Hollywood showed you was the soft version. The truth was gruesome, prolonged and calculated with near scientific precision to deliver a clear message, rebel against the empire. This is the price. So before you get too comfortable, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. But only if you truly enjoy what we're doing here. Where are you listening from? Maybe a small room in Berlin, a quiet corner of Tokyo. A living room in Sydney, or late at night in California. Share where you are and what time it is so we'll know what time zone this evening's tale is carrying you to sleep in. Now dim the lights, turn on a gentle fan or some background noise, and let's step into tonight's journey. And so you and I begin to drift into a story, one that has been wrapped in film, cloaked in national pride. But inside still smolders, with a scent like smoke, rusted steel, and something deeper. The deliberate dismantling of a human being. William Wallace. A name that sounds both valiant and sorrowful, as if born to ignite a rebellion, only to be consumed by the very fire he lit. In the late 13th century, Scotland was far from the peaceful land of sheep and traditional music you often see in relaxing videos. No, it was a place of tension, power struggles, and most of all, there was no gentle narrator to help you fall asleep. At that time, King Edward I of England, affectionately called by historians the Hammer of the Scots, was trying to break the spine of an entire nation. But then, he encountered a small problem, Wallace. Not a nobleman, not trained in elite military academies, and definitely not a master of court diplomacy. Just the son of a landowner close to nature, and you might like this. Wallace was very good at chopping wood. There's a famous battle you may have heard of, the Battle of Stirling Bridge. In that battle, Wallace and his underdog army, let's call them poor but fierce, defeated the English forces unexpectedly. That victory was more than a blow to Edward's reputation. It gave the Scottish people a reason to dream. And as you know, empires don't like dreamers. After the victory, Wallace was named Guardian of Scotland. A title that sounds grand, but was really more like being given class president in a classroom on fire. Still, for that brief moment, Wallace became a symbol not of power, but of something uncontainable belief. Historians still debate his true origins. Some say he was minor nobility, others say he was a commoner. Some ancient documents claim he knew Latin, which might make you feel a bit jealous if you ever dropped out of French after 3 lessons. But regardless of origin, Wallace was a thorn in the side of the English crown. And as you can guess, a thorn left unplucked eventually pricks something. In the end, he wasn't captured because he lost a battle, but because he was betrayed. A detail very fitting for a long-running historical drama. The betrayer was a Scottish noble named John Menteith. The story isn't clear enough to write a pardon for him, but it's enough to chill your heart a little when thinking of those on your side. From here, everything begins to turn gray. No more glorious battles. Instead, a journey to London, long, slow, and utterly intentional. They didn't hide him from the public. They displayed him like a living trophy, shackled, stripped to the waist on horseback, often denied food and rest. A kind of torture tourism you'd never find on Airbnb. The point of this public display wasn't just to humiliate Wallace. It was to make sure everyone along the road, from peasants to nobles, saw one thing clearly: no one defies the crown without paying the price. A lesson delivered with live visuals like middle school history class, but this time with a flesh and blood led actor. One little-known fact: even while bound and brutalized along the road, Wallace remained almost completely silent. No pleas, no cries. Some accounts say he would at times look directly at the crowd, not in defiance, but as if remembering. A kind of medieval mental recording, no camera needed, just eyes. You see, even before being brought to the execution ground, Wallace had already begun to die in the public eye. Not because he was weaker, but because the crowd had been taught he deserved it. A subtle kind of perception manipulation that ancient empires mastered well. You could call it royal propaganda. No social media, but still chillingly effective. At this point, you're probably wondering, how could a person endure such things? The answer is simple. The human body, when pushed to its limits, doesn't shatter like glass. It fractures like stone, bit by bit, day by day. And Wallace, in silence, cracked like that. Perhaps the most terrifying part wasn't the blades or the chains. It was the waiting. The knowing that death was coming, not as an end, but as a performance. You've waited before for exam results, a text from someone you love, or for sleep to arrive. Wallace waited for death like an actor who knows the script, but must still walk onto the stage. And then the performance began. If you thought execution grounds were silent, solemn places, like in historical films, not in Smithfield. Picture a crowded market, the smell of roasting meat, cheap alcohol, and hundreds of curious onlookers packed together as if waiting for a weekend circus. But instead of clowns on horseback or fire breathers, the main act was a ragged man dragged through mud and manure by rope. William Wallace, once a symbol of freedom, now became a living spectacle, at least for the final hours of his life. You could feel something strange in the air, as if the crowd knew what was coming was horrific. But no one intended to leave. They didn't come to pity. They came to believe this is what happens to those who defy the crown. A highly effective form of collective psychological control. If TikTok existed, then you might have seen clips titled, "Villain Gets What He Deserves." #justice, #middle-age vibes. You're sitting in a quiet place, maybe your bed, maybe a soft couch somewhere safe. But Wallace wasn't. He was hanged, but only to the point of suffocation, not to death. Yes, this wasn't execution, this was simulated death. Hoisted up to choke, then brought down again. The body writhing, lungs in panic, blood rushing to the face until consciousness blurred into a dark haze of pain and confusion. It sounds horrific, and yet did you know? In old records, this phase was called the opening act. Yes, like at a musical, when the band begins to play the overture. And perhaps now's a good time to silently appreciate that you were born in an era with memory foam mattresses and chamomile tea. After the near-death segment, Wallace was laid on a wooden platform, but not to rest, only to prepare for the political dissection, where the body becomes a canvas and each cut a message. Here the executioner wasn't merely a killer, he was a storyteller, and his tools, not words but blades. Historians still debate the exact details of what happened next, partly due to a lack of official records, and partly because the surviving descriptions are too horrifying to repeat word for word. But what's important to note is, this was not just about killing. It was about erasure. Erasing a symbol. Erasing an idea. As if tearing up a letter could destroy the feelings written inside. One rarely mentioned detail: the execution site Smithfield used to be a slaughterhouse. Choosing this place was no coincidence. It carried a subtle message you might miss if you're not paying attention. This is no longer a man. This is meat. A degradation of humanity. And you know, when society decides who counts as human and who doesn't, anything becomes possible. Yet despite everything according to records, Wallace did not cry. He did not beg. He did not plead for mercy. If there was trembling, it was because his body could no longer endure. But his mind or his faith or some primal instinct remained silent. And you know what? In that context, silence was the loudest sound of all. Some believe that this was the moment he became immortal, not because he survived, but because from that moment, Wallace was no longer a man. He became a question that lives on. Is it worth dying for belief? If you're lying down now and your eyes begin to feel heavy, it's not just because of the voice telling the story, but because you've just gone through a journey full of contradictions, between justice and performance, between man and symbol, between power and memory. The strange thing is, after it all ended, Wallace was not buried in a solemn grave. No statue, no speech. He was cut into 4 parts and sent to 4 different cities, as if to scatter the message, "Don't do this," across the map of England. You could call it medieval PR, a bit gory, but highly effective. Ironically, that made him unforgettable. The body parts hung at the city gates slowly rotted, but the story spread. From taverns to marketplaces, from whispered poems to lullabies. And gradually, Wallace's image no longer belonged to the crowd that had jeered him, but to those who whispered, "We could be different." Now then, if you're still awake, take a deep breath. Not because Wallace needs your sympathy, but because you're living in a world where his death is just a story. A story that can be told again on a night like this when everything is quiet, and history has a chance to whisper to you through sleep. You know, in so many stories of great rebels, there's a pattern that repeats itself so often, it's almost sad to admit. They don't fall because their enemies are stronger, but because someone on their side stabbed them in the back. Wallace was no different. By the early 14th century, when glorious victories like Stirling had faded into memory, and the people of Scotland were weary from war, from fear, from the endless cold of winter, it was the noble class itself that began to fracture. Some still believed in resistance. Others believed in bags of gold and promises of forgiveness from King Edward of England. Historians still debate the true role of John Menteith, the man who captured Wallace. Some sources say he did it because Wallace was a political threat. Others claim Menteith was forced. And some simply say he thought it would make life easier. Whatever the reason, the result was, the same Wallace was betrayed by a fellow countryman. Imagine this, living in the woods, hiding in darkness, fleeing from the hunt of an empire. No GPS, no trustworthy friends, no idea where the next meal will come from. Then one day, you think you're walking into safety, into a place where someone welcomes you. But instead of a meal, a chain. Instead of hope, a downcast gaze avoiding yours. Nothing hurts more than betrayal, wrapped in kindness. Wallace was captured in 1305. In or near Glasgow records aren't entirely clear. He wasn't caught in battle, not felled in a grand ambush. He wasn't fighting, wasn't wielding a sword. When he was taken, he was walking, believing he was meeting allies. And perhaps in that moment, the first thing he felt wasn't fear, but regret. One little-known fact is that after the defeat at Falkirk in 1298, Wallace didn't simply disappear. He continued to operate underground, traveled to France to seek support from other kingdoms, wrote diplomatic letters, sought ways to save his country, a kind of guerrilla diplomacy. You can imagine a medieval political activist just without a laptop. But because he refused to surrender, refused to give up, refused to retire like so many others, he became the greatest threat to the empire's version of peace. And as you already know, every regime fears a person who has nothing left to lose, but still has faith. To make it easier to understand, just imagine Wallace as a social media movement icon today. Someone with no official power, no formal title, but whose every word still made the authorities uneasy. And you know what's more dangerous than an army? An idea you can't kill. So the English didn't just want to capture Wallace. They wanted to capture him in a way that made everyone else afraid. Not for a specific crime, but to turn him into a mirror of consequence. A living illustration of the message. You can resist, but you'll be dragged to London in chains. And that's exactly what they did. Still awake, if not, that's fine too. But if you're still listening, pay attention. Wallace wasn't captured because he was weak. He was captured because he didn't give up. Wallace, after being captured by a fellow countryman, was not executed on the spot, nor quietly killed to keep things simple. No. They wanted to make him an example, a vivid demonstration of what empires do best: public punishment for silent deterrence. And so he was escorted to London. Sounds like being invited to a conference, but in reality it was a long, exhausting, and deeply humiliating parade. They didn't move him quickly. They moved him slowly, very slowly, through villages, towns, over rough stone roads, past hundreds of eyes, not to receive help, but to be seen as evidence. Wallace didn't travel in a covered carriage like the historical figures Netflix dramatizes. No roof, no warmth. He was tied up, either riding a bare horse or dragged behind a cart, denied proper sleep and food, and at times displayed for public jeering or stone throwing. A kind of mobile media in the pre-newspaper era, and don't laugh because it worked with cruel efficiency. What you must remember is he hadn't been convicted. No sentence had been passed. But that journey was already a sentence executed through stares, the silence of passers-by, and every jolt of the skinny horse over muddy roads. Finally, in August 1305, Wallace arrived in London. But not as an envoy, nor a political negotiator. He was taken to Westminster Hall, the heart of legal and royal authority. A place that had seen trials of royalty of knights, and now a man who wasn't of noble blood, but too significant to ignore. Wallace wasn't allowed to speak much. He had no lawyer, no full presentation, no witnesses in his defense. To put it in modern terms, this was a trial barely formal, heavily loaded. The script had already been written. The actors just needed to say their lines. The charge. Oh, you'll love this one, treason. Sounds fitting, right? Except Wallace had never sworn allegiance to King Edward. He wasn't a subject of England. In the trial, Wallace, with a voice still full of defiance, said a line that silenced the room. I could not be a traitor, for I was never his subject. That sentence was short. But if you're a government fearful of a symbol, it was an unforgivable one. It didn't just deny the king's authority. It denied the very foundation of the empire's existence. And as you know, empires can forgive ignorance, but never a challenge to their meaning. And so the sentence was pronounced. Not a simple execution, but a sequence of punishments, prolonged, deliberate, deeply symbolic, like a dark ritual choreographed by the advisors of power. Modern historians still debate, was it necessary to go that far? Some say Wallace's brutal execution was meant to crush the rebellion completely. Others believe the cruelty only turned him into a legend, and from a communication perspective, it backfired spectacularly. But you're here listening to this now, so you probably know who won in the long run, don't you? And that's how one man without a crown, without an army, without a throne, forced an entire empire to stage an entire spectacle for one purpose: to erase him from memory. Too bad they failed. Not the modern Smithfield with calves and double-decker buses, but Smithfield in 1305, when the air smelled of burnt fat, old blood, and the murmuring anticipation of a crowd. Back then, Smithfield was a livestock market, literally, and also a place where they killed not just cattle but people. And that day, the main course wasn't roasted pork. It was a man brought out for display, like a ritual of deterrence. William Wallace, once the symbol of a rising nation, now bound, hand and foot dragged through the streets before arriving at the place where he would be taken apart not just by blades, but by cold political intent. You see, there are many ways to end a human life. But the method the English chose for Wallace wasn't about ending. They didn't want him to die quickly. They wanted him to unravel from body to meaning. Every act in the sentence carried a layer of symbolism, as if they were using Wallace's very body to write a message in flesh and bone. This is the fate of those who dare to dream otherwise. The first punishment to be hanged until near death. Not like in the movies where the rope snaps the neck instantly. No, here Wallace was slowly lifted by hand, not to die, but to linger. Limbs twitching, face turning purple, lungs pounding as if about to explode. And then they cut the rope before he died. If you've ever choked on water or had trouble breathing, you know the feeling. Now imagine that happening under the cheers of hundreds of eyes. A perfect opening act for the symphony of fear. Next came the part modern sources often avoid: humiliation and castration. It'll be gentle here because you're about to sleep. But simply put, Wallace was rendered incapable of producing offspring in front of the crowd. Not to kill him, but to declare your ideas will never be passed on. Historians still debate whether these actions were random brutality or darkly calculated. Some believe it was a form of symbolic embodiment, each part of the body handled to reflect a specific message the Empire wanted to send. As for you all, you need to know is, they didn't just kill him. They performed his death. Every blade had an audience. Every gesture was measured like stage lighting. The crowd didn't come to watch Wallace die. They came to be entertained by the end of a legend. One thing few people know throughout the entire ordeal: Wallace didn't scream. Maybe he didn't have the strength. Maybe he refused to give them the satisfaction. Or maybe silence was the only thing he still had control over. And then his heart was removed. But it didn't end there. Finally, he was beheaded. And it didn't stop there either. His body was quartered, with each part sent to a different city: Newcastle, Stirling, Berwick upon Tweed, and Perth. Not to be buried, but to be hung above city gates, left to the rain and sun, so that anyone passing by would have to look up and remember, this is the price you pay for daring to believe in freedom. Think about that. Even death wasn't enough. They had to divide him so that no place could hold the full memory of him. And yet perhaps that is exactly where they failed. Because by scattering his limbs across the land, they unintentionally multiplied his image. When they hung his head above a gate, they made him a symbol. And while the body decayed, the story lived on in taverns, in lullabies, in a people's longing for independence. Wallace was dead. But the name never truly rested. The year Wallace was executed, 1305. England was under the rule of King Edward I, also known by the very affectionate and not at all terrifying nickname, Hammer of the Scots. Sounds strong, yes, but a bit like naming your home Wi-Fi Supreme Power Grand on the surface, but filled with underlying insecurity. Edward I wasn't a bad king by the standards of his time. On the contrary, he was intelligent, decisive, and particularly skilled at suppression. He had successfully conquered Wales, built a network of castles, and issued laws to strengthen central authority. He was very good at making you feel like he was being fair right before taking everything you had in the name of royal order. Domestically, Edward was a lover of law, but laws of his own making, written by him and serving him. Some modern historians view him as a foundational figure in the development of English legal tradition. But you know, laying the foundation of law while hanging someone for not being your subject. Maybe that foundation's a little crooked. At the time, England was expanding its territory and consolidating royal power, but it was also tangled in social unrest and drained by war expenses. The nobility were growing resentful of property seizures and arbitrary taxation. Common folk, well, they had never had much of a voice, but now they were starting to whisper. One interesting and often overlooked fact: in 1290, Edward I expelled all Jews from England, one of the earliest comprehensive expulsions in Europe. This act reflected not only the deep religious intolerance of the time, but also a mindset of unity through exclusion. The idea of stabilizing a kingdom by eliminating all difference. A classic strategy, but a cruel one. Politically, he also initiated moves toward absolute monarchy, laying the groundwork for the centuries-long struggle between crown and parliament. Edward wanted a strong England, but strong under a single hand. That's also why when Scotland began to rebel, it wasn't just a military nuisance. It was a personal challenge to honor. Edward couldn't accept that a small, cold, mountainous land full of bagpipes dared to resist his will. Wallace wasn't just a rebel, he was a slap in the face to a king unaccustomed to being denied. There's a strange story rarely mentioned. Edward once brought a wooden coffin with him when marching north, as if to say, "I will not return until Scotland is crushed, or I will die here." A detail both tragic and slightly theatrical, don't you think? But no matter how resolute, Edward's power didn't last forever. Just 2 years after Wallace's execution, he died in 1307. On his deathbed, he left a will that his body be cut into several pieces and sent to the borders to continue guarding the kingdom. Sound familiar? Perhaps he borrowed a page from Wallace's own sentence. After Edward's death, the throne passed to his son, Edward II, who history remembers as one of the weakest kings of England. But that's another story, and if you're still awake in the next video, well, step into a time when the throne rocked like an unevenly hung hammock. Now you know why Wallace wasn't simply killed. He was broken as part of a larger plan by a king who believed domination didn't need to be justified, only performed. If you're lying in bed listening to the gentle whirl of a fan, exhale slowly. Every empire ends. Every king becomes just a name in a book. But people like Wallace, they disappear from life, but live on in stories like tonight's, quiet, sorrowful, and worth remembering. Sleep well. And if you're still awake, don't worry. The next story is already waiting behind your dreams. After Edward with the Hammer of the Scots, the throne passed to his son Edward II. It sounds like a smooth succession, but in reality it was like replacing a seasoned warrior with a boy who liked playing music and loved his best friend more than the crown. Yes, not joking. Edward II reigned from 1307 to 1327. And that period is remembered not for glorious victories, but because everything unraveled like a ball of yarn mauled by a cat. If you just heard the name Wallace and felt awe at his bravery, now you might feel a bit confused about the successor to the throne who ordered his death, because Edward II is one of the most criticized kings in English history. First, let's talk about personality. If his father was the image of sternness and resolve, Edward II became known for a special affection toward a young nobleman named Piers Gaveston. This relationship irritated the entire court to the point where the nobility rose up not just out of a hunger for power, but out of envy. Not of romance, but of influence. Gaveston was granted titles, land power, and honor, while old noble families were tossed aside like worn-out coats. Imagine working your whole life in a family company only for the boss's son to become CEO and appoint his best friend as deputy. You can bet the office atmosphere wouldn't be sleep-inducing. But things didn't stop there. Edward II was militarily weak, unpopular with the nobility, and most notably, suffered a disastrous defeat in the war with Scotland. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 was a defining example. The English army was stronger, larger, and better equipped, and still they were utterly defeated by Robert the Bruce. You remember Robert the Bruce, right? The spiritual successor to Wallace. He had once abandoned Wallace, but later rose, united the forces, and truly drove the English out. So if Wallace was the spark, Robert was the fire rising from the ashes. The Battle of Bannockburn wasn't just a military failure. It shattered Edward II's image in the eyes of the people. A king who couldn't win battles, couldn't win hearts, and was increasingly isolated due to his favoritism. A kind of crown without command. Things became even more tragic when even his wife, Isabella of France, turned against him. If you're a fan of period dramas, this is the part where the villain is your own wife. Isabella, along with her lover Roger Mortimer, overthrew Edward II in 1327. And yes, they didn't just dethrone him, they imprisoned him. And according to some accounts, still debated by historians, he may have been murdered in a horrific way. Some sources claim that Edward II was killed with a red-hot iron rod inserted into a place no one wants to imagine, so as to leave no visible marks. It sounds horrific, but if true, his death reflects an era where punishment and power were inseparable, and every act of defiance came at a cost beyond comprehension. Modern historians still disagree on the details of his death. Some believe he was killed. Others think he lived in secret exile. Whatever the truth, Edward II remains a vivid reminder that being born a king doesn't mean you're fit to rule. And sitting on a throne doesn't mean you hold the people's hearts. So now you see William Wallace died a painful public thunderous death. But those who killed him, from King Edward I to his successor, didn't have peaceful endings either. History can be just. It's just not in a hurry. If you're still listening, your eyes beginning to drift closed, remember this: power is never immortal. It only lasts as long as it is remembered, and it crumbles the moment people stop believing in it. Thank you for staying with me this far. May you sleep deeply peacefully, and if you dream, may it be of a world where justice needs no lash and freedom costs no blood. If Edward II was the king who was overthrown, then it was his own wife, Isabella of France, who held the winning hand. Remember Isabella? A young French princess married to the King of England at just 12 years old, originally just a diplomatic pawn between two empires. But who would have guessed that pawn could move backward diagonally and eventually checkmate? After watching her husband Edward II place all his trust and power in Piers Gaveston and later in Hugh Despenser, Isabella slowly realized that in this marriage the king's heart was in the wrong place. And just like a character out of a Shakespearean tragedy, Isabella didn't weep. She plotted. In 1325, Isabella was sent to France to negotiate peace. But instead of returning, she stayed. And not only that, she began a public relationship with an exiled English nobleman, Roger Mortimer. A relationship that was both romantic and political. And as you know, in the Middle Ages, things like that never ended quietly. Together with Mortimer, Isabella gathered a small army, returned to England in 1326, and surprisingly, met almost no resistance. The nobility were tired of Edward II. Even the common people sighed in relief, as if the Queen had returned bearing truth beneath her black velvet gown. Edward II fled, was captured, and imprisoned. And then, as you've already heard, he vanished. No longer king, no longer husband, no longer a problem. Isabella and Mortimer took control, but not under the titles of Queen and new King. Instead, they placed Isabella's 14-year-old son Edward III on the throne and ruled in his name as regents. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Until Edward III grew up. In 1330, just 4 years after the coup, Edward III, then only 17, turned the tables on his own mother and Mortimer. One quiet evening, the young king ordered Mortimer's arrest at Nottingham Castle. By the next morning, Mortimer was convicted of treason and hanged shortly after. And Isabella, she wasn't killed. but she was forced into seclusion in a castle for the rest of her life. No throne, no power, only the silence of a woman who had once overthrown an entire dynasty. Strange, isn't it, that in the same century a man like Wallace died for refusing to kneel. A king like Edward II died for being too weak to hold the crown. And a woman like Isabella Wise, cunning but overreaching, was overthrown by her own son. As if power is a mirror, and anyone who stares into it too long becomes distorted by their own ambition. Are you still awake? If your eyes are heavy now, let this story carry you into sleep, not because it's gentle, but because it reminds you that no matter how many centuries pass, humanity still circles the same loops: power, love, betrayal, and silence. And somewhere in the dark, history continues to repeat itself, not with swords and horses, but through messages, strategy meetings, and private lawyers. Just a moment ago, we paused at a strange point when Isabella of France, who had once overthrown her husband, was pushed aside by her own son, Edward III. And here Edward III was the one who truly restored the image of English royalty, no longer crumbling like in his father's time, no longer gloomy like in his grandfather's. The teenager who had watched his mother manipulate the throne had grown up and decided enough. It was time for the English to be ruled by a truly English king. Ascending the throne at 17, Edward III didn't disappoint. He not only restored the honor of the Plantagenet dynasty, but also launched an era of aggressive expansion, pulling all of Europe into a chessboard soaked in war, what you might know from school as the 100 Years' War. Yes, that's right. It was Edward III who ignited the longest war in European history, lasting from 1337 to 1453. A stretch of time long enough for you to knit a scarf and leave a will for 3 generations. But don't let the name fool you. 100 years didn't mean constant battle. It was a patchwork of intermittent wars, treaties, betrayals, rearmaments, and a few pauses for childbirth, remarriage, or running out of money to keep fighting. Back to Edward III, he had his reasons for war. His mother was French, and under the complicated royal inheritance laws of the time, he had a claim to the French throne after King Charles IV died without a male heir. The French side said, "Sorry, no way, the English get to rule France." Edward replied, "Let's see about that." And so war began. Remember how Wallace was torn apart to deter the Scots? In Edward III's generation, the English achieved spectacular military feats. The Battle of Crecy, 1346, then Poitiers, 1356, that made the French wonder. What are these people eating to shoot longbows so well? And if you're asking, what about the common people? The answer is they lived like dry leaves in a storm. Crops were burned, cities were looted, and sometimes people couldn't even tell the difference between country and enemy. A curious fact that often goes unnoticed: Edward III founded the Order of the Garter, the most prestigious and oldest chivalric order in England, still active today. Its origin is tied to a lady dropping her garter at a royal banquet, and King Edward picked it up and said, "Let whoever mocks this feel shame." From that point, the garter became a symbol of knighthood, yes. Romance in that era had a very peculiar tone. Domestically, Edward III was quite successful in stabilizing the economy and royal authority. Though later the plague. Yes, you guessed it, the Black Death struck in 1348, killing nearly half of England's population. A true specter in history, even more haunting than the executions at Smithfield. You see, we started with William Wallace, a man who refused to kneel. Then Edward I, who used violence to hold the throne. Then Edward II, who lost everything by failing to hold himself. Then Isabella, the woman who dared to flip the board. And now Edward III, who learned from them all and rewrote England's chapter with blood arrows and a prestigious garter order. History never stops. It simply changes characters, shifts stages, and whispers to you in sleepless nights. Don't think you've read the whole story. There's always a page no one's turned yet. Back in the early 15th century, Europe was no longer just divided by borders, but by the Church. Rome was still the center of Catholicism, but faith was no longer something you followed with your heart. It had become a system of power. And wherever there's a system, there's someone being crushed for refusing to bow. Jan Hus was born in Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic, in a world where the Bible could only be read in Latin and where the Pope could command entire armies. Imagine that at the time you couldn't understand your own scriptures, couldn't ask questions, and certainly couldn't challenge them. Believe or be silent. Two choices only. But Jan Hus didn't choose silence. He was a priest, a philosopher, and a lecturer at Charles University in Prague. And he began to do the unthinkable, preach in the local language, and worse, ask questions. Why was the Pope richer than the poor believers? Why did the Church sell indulgences? Why did forgiveness have to be printed on paper with an invoice? He didn't shout. He didn't flip tables. He simply preached. But that was precisely what made people afraid. Historians still debate whether Hus truly wanted to reform the Church or simply return to the core of faith. But whatever the case, the clergy of that time were not tolerant of dissent. And a man who questions is always more dangerous than one who rebels. In 1414, Hus was invited to the Council of Constance, a major assembly of popes and European princes. They said he would be granted safe conduct, a polite invitation. You know, back then you could be arrested just for reading the Bible a little too loudly. He went carrying hope of being heard, but beneath the vestments and rosaries, the truth awaited. As soon as he arrived, he was imprisoned. No fair trial, no theological debate. They locked him up like a criminal and later condemned him as a heretic. On July 6, 1415, in the square of Constance, Jan Hus was tied to a wooden stake. The crowd gathered, not to hear him preach as they once did, but to watch him burn like an offering. He was asked one last time, "Do you wish to recant?" He replied, "I will not do so. I cannot speak what I do not believe is true." A simple sentence. But you know, true courage isn't found in roars, it's found in calmness before death. They piled the wood, then lit the fire. Flames rose, and a voice was burned in the square, but its meaning did not burn with it. There's a strange detail, one that might send a chill down your spine or make you smile faintly. Before the fire touched him, Jan Hus began to sing. Yes, sing, not to beg, not to weep. Just sing, as if returning to something deeper than any verdict. They thought his death would silence the reform movement, but they forgot that a man burned can no longer stay silent, and his memory can spread like ashes in the wind. Later, Martin Luther, in writing the 95 Theses that shook Europe, mentioned Hus as the first torch. A century later, the Reformation swept across the continent, and Jan Hus, the burned priest, became the unofficial saint of those who refused to bow before injustice dressed in holy robes. So are you still awake? If not, that's all right. Because in that sleep, perhaps you'll dream of a square, a warm voice, and a man standing in fire, not trembling, only smiling. And if you're still here with me, the next time, we might speak of Giordano Bruno, another philosopher burned alive too, for the crime of thinking differently. Tonight, we continue with the story of Giordano Bruno. Not a pope, not a general, not a king. Giordano Bruno was simply a man who thought too much. And that in the 16th century could get you burned alive. Born in 1548 in Nola near Naples, Italy. Bruno grew up in an age when the world was believed to already know all that needed knowing. The Earth was the center. The planets orbited it in perfect circles. Heaven was above, hell was below, and if you asked about anything outside of that, you were either a genius or in trouble. Bruno was a bright child, quick-witted and dangerously curious. He became a Dominican friar, but instead of repeating what was already known, he began asking what no one dared to. For example, if the universe is God's creation, why should it have limits? Why only one world? Could there be countless others? If humanity is not the center of all things, then what are we? If these questions sound familiar to you, they should. These were astronomical, metaphysical, philosophical, and theological inquiries, all shaken together like an intellectual cocktail that no one at the time was ready to drink. Bruno didn't just agree with Copernicus, who first said the sun was at the center. He went much further. He said the universe has no center, no boundary, and there may be infinite worlds, infinite civilizations, infinite intelligences out there. Yes, he said this in 1584, while many still believed stars were holes poked into the firmament. You see, he wasn't burned for a telescope. He was burned for an idea. Bruno left the monastery. He traveled across Europe from Geneva to Paris, then London, then Wittenberg. In each place, he lectured on philosophy, cosmology, and spoke too directly for comfort. You know the type who just can't help but speak the truth, even if it ruins the dinner party. That was Bruno. Except instead of a party, he disrupted the very foundations of a civilization's worldview. In 1592, Bruno was lured back to Italy by a nobleman who invited him to teach. But it was a trap. He was arrested by the Inquisition and imprisoned for 7 years. Not 7 days, not 7 weeks, 7 years. In the cold cells of Rome, he was interrogated, enticed, promised, threatened, all to make him recant what he had written, what he had thought. Bruno refused. When the cardinals asked him, "Are you ready to abandon your heresies?" he replied, "I have nothing to recant. Perhaps you fear what I say more than I fear death." A sentence light as air, but it led him to the stake. On February 17, 1600, at Campo de Fiori, Rome, Giordano Bruno was brought into the square. They drove an iron spike through his tongue so he could not speak a final word. A gesture both cruel and knave. Because how do you nail shut a man's thoughts? The wood was piled. The flames rose, and Bruno, the philosopher of distant stars, was consumed beneath the curious eyes of the crowd. Today, at the very spot where he was burned, stands a statue of dark bronze, upright head, slightly bowed gaze fixed toward the Vatican, as if he's still waiting for an apology. Perhaps you're lying there now, eyes half closed, listening to this story and wondering, why are people so afraid of ideas? No one knows for sure. But perhaps it's because ideas, if strong enough, can burn down empires without fire. Are you still awake? If you've drifted off, may you dream of the stars, Bruno once imagined. And if you're still listening next time, we might speak of Galileo, the man who nearly burned but instead spent a lifetime under house arrest for daring to say, "The earth moves." You decide. For now, sleep well and dream without borders. After Bruno, the man burned for thinking far, comes Galileo Galilei, the man who nearly burned for saying the earth does not stand still. Sounds absurd, doesn't it? But imagine you say the sun does not revolve around us, and in return you're sentenced to lifelong house arrest. And if you refuse to recant, yes, you might become ash. Galileo was born in 1564 in Pisa, Italy, in a world on the brink of change. He lived at a moment when science was just beginning to emerge, but religion still held all the light that was allowed to shine. He was not a rebel like Bruno, nor did he dream of countless worlds beyond. Galileo simply looked through a lens, and it was that very lens that got him into trouble. In the early 17th century, Galileo built a telescope, then a cutting-edge piece of technology, and did something few had ever done: looked directly at the sky and observed honestly. He saw that the moon wasn't smooth and perfect, as people believed, but had craters, mountains, and cracks like an old rock. He saw satellites orbiting Jupiter, proving that not everything revolved around the Earth. Then he wrote books. And as you know, writing is a dangerous act, especially when what you write shakes the very universe people believe to be unshakable. Galileo supported Copernicus, who had proposed that the sun, not the Earth, was the center. Scientifically, it was a major leap forward. But politically, religiously, and psychologically, it was a revolution. And like every revolution, someone had to pay the price. And that someone was him. In 1616, the Vatican officially declared the heliocentric theory contrary to Scripture. Galileo at that time was warned, and he paused as someone who understood the danger of truth. But the years passed, and he resumed because once truth is seen, it's not easily forgotten. In 1632, he published Dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. The book was written as a conversation between three characters, one supporting Copernicus, one neutral, and one supporting Ptolemy, the Earth-centered model. The problem was the supporter of Ptolemy was portrayed as somewhat foolish and bore a name resembling the Pope at that time. There you have it. No swords needed. Galileo unintentionally insulted the most powerful man in the church. He was summoned, interrogated, tried by the Inquisition. They demanded he retract all support for heliocentrism. Otherwise, the sentence was the stake. Unlike Bruno Galileo, didn't stay silent. He recanted. He bowed. That allowed him to survive. But do you know what was passed down from that trial? A whispered phrase, maybe true, maybe just legend, but beautiful enough to carry into sleep tonight. After bowing his head, Galileo is said to have muttered, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. After the trial, Galileo was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. He lived in isolation, forbidden to publish, forbidden to teach, forbidden to write unless he wrote in silence. He died in 1642. No fire, no crowd. There was only an old man sitting by a window, his eyes fading but still thinking about the universe, where the earth quietly turned around the sun as if it had never been tried. Are you still awake? If your eyes begin to close, let the soft turning of the earth lull you to sleep. Because even though there was once a time when people tried to silence the idea that this planet orbits the sun, it still moves. And truth, it is always patient. It doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to win. It only needs to wait. You're still here, aren't you? Still listening, still letting these quiet stories carry you through the dark. Then we shall go on. Because when Giordano Bruno was burned for daring to think, and Galileo was silenced for daring to see, there would come a time when someone had to speak loudly and not bow. And that moment was when Martin Luther appeared, not as a warrior with a sword, but as a monk with a hammer. Martin Luther was born in 1483 in Germany, in an age when religion was not just faith, it was the most powerful system in Europe. The church at that time didn't just preach God's word. It collected taxes, sold indulgences, and sometimes acted like an empire wrapped in sacred cloth. Luther wasn't initially a rebel. He was an Augustinian monk, diligent, guilt-ridden, and desperate for forgiveness. So much so that at one point he prayed so excessively that the monastery priest said, "Martin, stop torturing yourself. God isn't as angry with you as you are." But it was that very yearning that led him to start asking questions. What ignited Luther's fire wasn't a divine vision or mystical encounter. It was a leaflet. A small piece of paper sold in town squares claiming that if you paid a bit of money, you'd be forgiven. Not by repentance, but by currency. When the coin in the coffer rings the soul from purgatory springs. A religious slogan of the time, sounding more like an advertisement than a promise of grace. Luther couldn't take it. not because he wanted to overthrow the Pope, but because he believed that forgiveness was a gift from God, not a product for sale. And so he picked up the hammer. On October 31st, 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg church, a simple act like posting a notice. But that hammer struck a blow that shook the world. In those 95 Theses, he did not deny the faith. He did not call the church the enemy. He simply said, "We are going the wrong way, and someone needs to stop." Historians still debate. Did Luther actually nail the Theses to the church door? Or was that image a legend added later? The answer, maybe, maybe not, but the meaning of the act has long surpassed the question of the hammer. It became a symbol of conscience knocking on the doors of power, demanding an answer. The church's response, of course, was not pleased. Luther was excommunicated, declared a heretic, summoned to Worms in 1521 to stand trial. There he was ordered to recant all his writings. He looked around, then said, "I cannot and I will not recant anything. My conscience is captive to the word of God. Here I stand. I can do no other. May God help me. Amen." You see, there was no shouting, no spear. Just one man standing in the storm, refusing to bow. Luther escaped death thanks to the protection of a noble prince, and from there the Protestant Reformation erupted. He translated the Bible into German so anyone could read it. He taught that people didn't need an intermediary to reach God. He planted the seeds of religious freedom and opened a new chapter in European history, one in which the church was no longer the sole summit of power. Like Bruno, like Galileo, Luther dared to say what many only dared to think. The difference was, he survived. Martin Luther did not die at the stake. He lived to 62, a considerable age for that era, and passed away in his sleep in the same small town where he was born. But the strange thing is, his ideas did not sleep. From one hammer on a wooden door sprang hundreds of new churches, thousands of Bible translations, and millions of people who for the first time believed they could approach God without passing through the gates of an empire. And from that, a new age began. An age in which words could unseat thrones, and a handwritten book could create a wave greater than any army. You see, through Bruno Galileo Luther, whether burned, silenced, or threatened, truth never truly dies. It only needs one brave soul to keep it alive for one more night. And now our story is done. The dim lamp has flickered low. If you're still awake, take a gentle breath. You've traveled through centuries with nothing but ears and imagination. And if you've fallen asleep, then that's all right. Because sometimes courage begins with a quiet dream. Sleep deeply. Sleep like Galileo looking to the stars. Sleep like Luther setting down his hammer. And if you dream, may you dream of truth blooming peacefully in a world where no one fears what is right. See you in the next story. Good night.